Well, welcome everybody to this wonderful program that we have tonight with a very special guest. And I think I'm going to start out with our land acknowledgement, which was something that we learned how to put together during our How to Be a Good Neighbor. So I'm acknowledging that I live on the land that once belonged to the Calusa Indians, who suffered with the genocide at the hands of the Spanish explorers. This is the land where the Calusa created a sophisticated society, celebrated life and stewarded the lands and waters, raised their families, fished, and buried their deceased ancestors. Today, the Seminole and Miccosukee Indians steward the tree islands, land, and waters of the Everglades, which is their homeland, as well as the burial land of their ancestors. I do this in acknowledgement of the fact that I now know that the land about colonization and that the land was really not discovered, but rather stolen from the indigenous people. And I feel like it's my duty as a citizen to inform anyone that I know those things. So that's my land acknowledgement. That's the first time I've actually given it, other than to the How to Be a Good Neighbor. I'm the co-founder and the president of the Southwest Florida RESET Center. So, and I think Holly did flash us a little while ago what that actually means for restorative, sustainable, economic, and transformational, which is what we're actually looking to do, is to transform people's hearts. Because the only way that you can actually do that is if you reach their hearts, not their heads. So a little over 3 years ago, we were just 6 concerned citizens and decided to try out Margaret Mead's famous quote, to change the world. Never forget that a group of committed citizens, a small group of committed citizens, can change the world, for it indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And actually, I can say that we are making a difference. So, and that has made a difference to us in fighting against climate change. So I've already told you what reset means. And if you learn anything from this conversation, we'd like to hear from you. We don't usually ask that, but we're kind of collecting testimonials from people that would like to comment on what they learned from the presentations that we make. So you can just make it simple and personal. There goes my phone, and I should have turned it off. I just did. So we have a guest with us tonight. Her name is Dr. Lise Susteren. She's a general, and I think a very fascinating subject, a forensic psychiatrist in Washington, D.C., and an expert on the physical and mental health effects of climate disruption, which we definitely want to hear about. She's also a clinical associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral at George Washington University and co-founder of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance. I know that she has lots of other things behind her name. She has a book which is called Emotional Inflammation. Is that right, Lise? Which I just ordered today, just to let you know, because I want to read it. So take it away, Lise. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about, first of all, why you decided to write that book, and maybe just a little bit of what's in it. Maybe we can interest some of the people, because I listened to a YouTube video today about the 4 reactive types. And I think that's really important today, because we're so divided. Our country is so divided. And then we're going to talk about what you do with climate change and the mental health effects, because I don't know that a lot of people actually associate climate change with mental health. Maybe after Ian, they do, but I don't know if they realize that their mental health, their depression, their anxiety is coming from climate change and a lot of the other catastrophic things that we're having to face.
First of all, I am very honored to be with all of you. We all do this work, and certainly we do it for the right reasons, because we're not getting necessarily what you would be getting if you were doing it for social status or financial advancement or anything else. We're doing it for love of the earth, love of nature, and a respect that we have for all life. And to be with people like that is the silver lining of activism in climate and environmental issues. When I got into this, I remember thinking to myself, gosh, as hard as this is, I never would have met all these marvelous people. That is a silver lining. Clearly, it'd be an advantage for us not to have to do this, but nonetheless, let's recognize the amazing people that we find in doing this work. Yeah. So thank you. I'm very honored to be here. The book, Emotional Inflammation, was written with my good buddy, Stacy Colino. Stacy had interviewed me for a piece that she was writing for USA Today, I believe. And she asked me if we could write a book together. And I remember thinking, geez, we haven't even been on a date yet. And she's asking me if we can get married. And I was thinking, well, and she realized she was experienced at this. I was not, at finding people to co-author books with. And so we started meeting a couple of times, had coffee at a local bookstore. So we fast forward, started talking about these issues. And primarily for me, after all these years of speaking with people about their feelings and moods and thoughts, the realization increasingly, and this has been budding since before my activism in climate, which began, I ran for the US Senate here in Maryland, and in 2005, 2006, and as Frank Mankiewicz once said after he lost an election, the people have spoken, he said, the bastards. So if you'll just allow me to have quoted him, I did not prevail in that Senate race. It still niggles me a little bit, but so be it. But in the aftermath, I was committed to climate issues, and all of the things that I'd been thinking in talking to people all those years before really came into focus. And that is that here we are, shaped by the hand of nature, and yet we are systematically distancing ourselves or renouncing our connections, and indeed even destroying that very hand that shaped us. And so my work is to keep people from engaging in self-destructive behaviors, and indeed to look at their behaviors today and see how they're going to have an adverse effect down the road. It was my belief when I first got into this work that we would run the numbers, see that we were clearly making big dumb mistakes with our carbon emissions, and voila, we would set about restoring our course to health. And not a newsflash to you, but our parts per million of carbon dioxide have only increased, and they've increased from 390 to sometimes 415 or so now. Quite a spread, 25 points in just a few years. And of course, many more since the Industrial Revolution and since the 1950s, but we don't have to go there. So the book really was an effort to address Middle America, not necessarily just climate activists. Hence, what I did was I talked about a number of social justice issues that are prevalent or preeminent even in our minds and hearts. And that is gun violence, for example, human rights violations, wage gap, racial injustice, and of course, at the very top of the list, but I put it at the bottom because just a tip, my friend who is a master of persuasion says, if you want to draw attention to something, put it either first or last, but don't bury it in the middle. So climate disruption, so that I wouldn't turn people off who thought the book was just about climate rather than about revering the hand that shaped us. I put climate disruption at the end, but the book was a means to address climate disruption, and of course, the attendant environmental degradation. So the book chapters, each one, just like your reset stands for something, restore, is the idea of our regaining our connection to nature and to recognize that so much of what we are doing is within our conscious control, and that our behaviors really belie what's best for us, which includes our failure to recognize that a good 70 or 80% of the decisions that we make, the influence that we feel from others, takes place on an unconscious level. So restore is really to remind yourself of your emotional reactor types, who you are emotionally, to evaluate your triggers, S to stabilize your body, T is all about your thinking, O is to obey things like the circadian rhythm, R is a return to nature, and E is the energy that we can get from engaging in empowering action, which is, of course, all about what you do. So you do these things naturally, but the book is divided into those so that people can conveniently see the ways in which they can make changes that improve their own connection to themselves, each other, and to the hand that shaped us. So that's the book in a nutshell.
Thank you. Thank you. So first of all, can you tell us what a forensic psychiatrist is?
Yes.
I'm sure no one knows.
It is everything to do with psychiatry or psychology and the law. So anytime you have a legal question and it directly calls upon one's knowledge or expertise in human or in psychology or psychiatry, you would engage a forensic psychiatrist. So it's the interface between the law and psychology, psychiatry.
Okay. And Holly?
Well, I just to tag on your question, I see you identified as a climate psychiatrist.
Right.
So the field of climate psychology and climate psychiatry, I'm wondering if you could tell us about that, because you're the first person I ever even heard of that was a climate psychiatrist. That the forensic part I get, but that is really awesome. Can you tell us?
Okay,
about
well,
that?
you know, I didn't know that I was referred to as such, but I will acknowledge that I have been working hard to appeal to our professional organizations, the American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological, National Association of Social Workers, et cetera, to influence them to organize a subspecialty in climate and mental health, because it is very clear that as the years unspool and extreme weather events become ever more frequent and intense, and the conditions that are chronic become more pronounced, that we will have an attendant psychological unraveling. And so just as I've thought to myself, and you have, I'm sure too, that we've exceeded our carrying capacity as far as our resources are concerned, we risk exceeding our capacity as far as our resilience is concerned. And we need people who are trained to understand the aspects of psychology and human behavior, as well as how to influence people in power and have an understanding of energy issues and environmental issues, and of course, climate issues, and to have been trained to be able to speak persuasively and confidently in front of the people and communities, whether it's policymakers or community organizations and others, to make sure that they stay healthy and that they have the tools they need to maintain resilience and restore, of course, what we have degraded. So that's the subspecialty that I'm intrigued. I'm called a climate psychiatrist when I'm still trying to make the case for there to be such a subspecialty, but maybe things are advancing as they often do sometimes. Well, there's that saying, not everything that counts can be counted. So maybe just talking about it a lot is having some kind of impact.
Yeah.
I just wanted to interject something here, is that Lise would prefer that instead of waiting until the end of her talking in our conversation, is that if you have any questions, that you please raise your hand and ask them now. This is more of a conversation and a dialogue than it is a monologue.
Indeed. Thank you for saying that, Linda, and for reminding everyone. And if it's a challenging question, that's good. I mean, as a psychiatrist, I'm used to people coming in and trying out some of their worst thoughts on me, like maybe you're incompetent, or I think you're incompetent, and all the rest. So I'm pretty stable in the saddle, having served or sat in it now for many decades. So do not hesitate to challenge me on anything or to bore down on policies or mobilizing or anything else.
Is it?
I see Ensign.
Ensign?
Yeah.
Well, I'll first say that my tagline on all my emails is the climate is changing. Why aren't we? It's not a hoax. So you clearly know when you get one of my emails where I'm at. And I was at an event, I don't know, 20 years ago or something with Matthew Fox. And he talked about how we were in a massive state of denial. And there's every reason to be in denial, denial of lots of things. But I'd be interested in what you have to say about that in terms of general psychology as opposed to individual psychology, you know, sort of mass psychology. Okay.
So the outright denial, well, as Al Gore says, the deniers are retreating faster than the glaciers. What I find is that people are especially now trying to distance themselves from it. And they try to protect themselves behind a wall of what appears to be, at the worst, an indifference, or maybe there's worse than indifference, or they will allow themselves very quietly and perhaps even unconsciously to see themselves as entitled. And for many of us who do have privileges, and financial, racial, geographic, etc., and who are not involved in this, there really are blinders, and they will use this distancing and disavowing their own personal responsibility as a psychological defense. Because until they're prepared to make changes and prepared to roll up their sleeves and help, they have to tell themselves on some level that the threat isn't as bad as it really is. And I will acknowledge to you that when I have friends talking about their grandchildren, and I know that they have a carbon intensive lifestyle, boy, it's really hard for me to keep my mouth shut. In the old days, now not so much, but I used to debate. I'd go to a dinner party and I'd start hearing about all these high carbon activities. And I'd think, when am I going to bring up climate? And I'd say, don't do it, don't do it. And I'd say, oh, I am going to do it. And I'd say, don't do it, don't do it. I'd do it. And of course, I could shut the dinner party down in seconds. And I would. And indeed, I even walked once into a Christmas party at a house where I had done that. And the host's first statement to me was, and don't talk about climate. So you're perceived as a Debbie Downer, as a, and just the other night, a friend said to me, when I was remarking about climate issues and about democracy, and, you know, I'm going to use this opportunity to say that democracy is not a default form of government. And when people are stressed, as they are with climate and will increasingly, we don't make the best judgments. And at times of stress, we regress, we become more fearful, and indeed respond to fear sometimes with anger. And we do look to people whom we perceive as strong leaders. And oftentimes they're nothing more than bullies and tyrants. And we know because we saw that recently. And so my concern is that we, many of us, will, in our fear, vote for people who are nothing but tyrants and bullies. And that's where you have an erosion of democracy. And, you know, we could lose a lot. And I think that all of us have a fear now that democracy is being eroded. And I won't get into some of the pillars that indicate, well, yes, I will. Stein Ringen, a very famous Oxford social scientist, has said that when the lights went out in Athens 2,000 years ago, it was that long until a representative republic emerged. And he cited 3 factors that he said were common to the US and to the UK, where he lives. And he said it was the gap between the haves and the have-nots, which we certainly see here. We've never had such a wide gap. The corruption and the quid pro quo that we see in our politics, where votes are exchanged for money because of special interests. And then third of all, what he describes as apathy or indifference. And I will say a feeling of being disenfranchised or not being involved in the political process, and indeed handing over, exchanging our values and our cherished beliefs to a person who promises to protect us indeed from people whom they and some of us might be scapegoating. So we do see an erosion of democracy. And I brought this up at an event where I was with friends. And one of the parting remarks of one of my friends was that she hoped that I was going to engage in some activities with her and with my other buddies to get me, quote, happy again. And so when we talk about denial and indifference, these are people who will talk to me about how much they love their grandchildren and about what they will do for their grandchildren, and indeed do for their grandchildren. But the reality of rolling up their sleeves and responding to danger, I believe that climate evokes in us some things akin to talking about our mortality, to talking about senescence, growing old, and eventually that nature will take its course. So we would no more go to a party and talk about what the music we plan to have played at our funeral, or who maybe will do the eulogy or show up and cry the hardest, then we will talk about climate. I think that it has become, or that it is, a metaphor for our own vulnerability, and people don't want to talk about vulnerability. So that is a very long-winded response to the question of denial.
It sounds like white fragility. Is climate
Doesn't it?
fragility.
Doesn't it?
Yeah, it feels like the
really,
denial
I like that.
of
I like that.
privilege.
Holly, I like that. It is. It's climate environmental fragility. That's exactly what it is.
Now, my colleagues, I'll just add this, that I get very frustrated with my colleagues because what we want is what you do, which is you take action, you do stuff.
Yeah.
And my colleagues, God love them, are very intent on, and this is partly pressure exerted by academia and by the milieu in which we find ourselves, are intent on publishing papers that endlessly describe the problem.
Yes.
We don't need any more
You need
description of the
activism.
problem.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
I'm like having a flashback of Vietnam War activism, and there being this gap between the intellectuals and the academics and the activists that were getting in the street, that were sitting in, that were singing the songs, that were getting arrested, that were forming affinity groups and doing civil disobedience. And there needs to be a coming together now of all of these communities because it's code red. We are in climate crisis, and we need to keep reminding even each other. Try to get comfortable, you know. My home is a constant reminder to me that of climate change, because it's not completely repaired yet, and we're going to move out of it real soon. But so are there others besides you? Do you work with people after a disaster for PTSD from the experience and the aftermath, which we're discovering here in Southwest Florida, and of course they know in New Orleans and other places, goes on for years and years and years, and our lives are changed forever, and many people are displaced. Are there very many people that really have the skills, or is there a way to learn the skills? And I know that you belong to two organizations that made me call you a climate psychiatrist, the Climate Psychiatry Alliance and the Climate Psychology Alliance. And so is that somewhere where there's training, and are people getting help? And is that alliance that you're part of, those alliances, what do they do? Oh, that was a loaded, too many questions.
Yeah.
That was too many questions. Just go where you want with it.
I can riff off it as long as you, but feel free to interrupt me. I like to be interrupted. I like the sort of jazziness of riffing off of each other. So don't hesitate to interrupt me. So taking it from the top, are there trainings to meet, or have I ever involved myself in post-disaster work? Yes, I did after Katrina in Houston at the Astrodome. I did after the earthquake in Haiti. And indeed, Tulane University has this summer, and I've applied to their leadership training it's called disaster leadership training. Mm-hmm. And it is especially billed for mental health professionals. So whether it's a disaster from an earthquake, which, by the way, earthquakes have a number of different sort of triggers, but if you go to the U.S. Geological Society, you will see, maybe you have to dig a little bit, but you will see that as ice melts, there's a huge redistribution of weight on tectonic plates. We know how much ice weighs. And they will, the U.S. Geological Society will discuss, or they have discussed, the role of the redistribution of weight on earthquakes. So we can always follow the trail back to climate issues as we look at earthquakes. And as I say, earthquakes are complex, just like suicides, many triggers, but they collectively can increase frequency and the intensity of what we're seeing today. So whether it's an earthquake or it's a tornado or it's a wildfire, does make a bit of a difference right now, a bit of a difference. And here's the difference. On the one hand, a natural disaster, if it's entirely natural, will be easier to put behind you because you can say to yourself, it was fated. There's nothing we could have done. Lightning struck, and well, I guess you could say the woods were drier, but let's say it is, and I'm trying to think now of a disaster that isn't linked to climate, and I can't think of any.
I don't think you can.
It is an entirely natural disaster. We can say it was the hand of God. And we are much more accepting. And indeed, the legal system recognizes that intentional harm is punished much more severely than harm that happens accidentally. So it's manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter. It's much different from first-degree murder, where you planned it and executed it. So too with climate, when people will increasingly recognize that despite all the warnings, we persisted, it's going to be harder for us to get over the fact that inaction has resulted in the damage. And this is particularly true of young people who are increasingly angry, fearful, and feel betrayed and abandoned.
Yes.
And I have seen the headlines, and maybe you have too, in newspapers looking at building codes in Turkey, and the comment that despite knowing full well that the building codes were not, did not assure safety, the recent construction violated those building codes. So inevitably, when the earthquake came, they were not resistant.
Yeah.
I look at it and I think, oh my God, here we are making this a banner headline. And all I can think of is, despite decades of warning on climate, action to forestall it or resolve it or manage it have not been taken. So we are seeing these things said over and over again. So is there leadership that is specific to the issue of climate? Yes. I will suggest that making a distinction between what's intentional and what truly is accidental is an important part. And I have forgotten the rest of your questions. What else did you ask, Holly? I've forgotten. I got
asking about the organizations, the organizations that you belong to.
Okay, right. So the organizations were founded really out of a desperation because everywhere I looked, and indeed I will acknowledge to you that in 2009, when we had what we believe is the first conference on it was called the psychological effects of global warming and why the U.S. mental health care system is not prepared. And believe it or not, I reached out to the American Psychiatric Association, and they told me they weren't interested. And I said, I wanted their president to come. And they said, she can't come, she won't come, she isn't interested, I can't remember what. And I said, well, then send a staff person. And I was thinking, well, you still don't have to come in scuba gear. And they said that they weren't interested either. And I remember talking to colleagues who said, what does climate have to do with psychological issues? And I was thinking, oh no. Geez, when your house is burned down, blown away, flooded, you've lost your belongings, maybe your pets, the community that you used to live in, all of your sources of support. Do you think you might have some psychological impacts? So apparently this was lost on them, and I know I'm bad-mouthing them, but I still, obviously 14 years later, still hold a grudge, because it is so unthinkable for us to be conscious of all people, mental health professionals, to distance ourselves from this. It was unconscionable, or is unconscionable. I did get the president of the American Psychological Association to come, and he ran with this much better than the psychiatrist did. But our organizations were founded out of desperation as I looked globally for any group that was addressing this. And I found in the UK a marvelous group of people. They sort of remind me of you in that they were small, they were tight, meaning they were geographically close. They were just outside of London mostly. And many of them took the train in when we all met to have lunch together. I had traveled there with the family when in the old days when I would hop on an airplane. And so I just fell in love with them. And I was so excited. They were called the Climate Psychology Alliance. And the idea was that we would have spokes on that wheel. They would be the hub, and we would be spokes all over the world. Well, I came back to the States and found out that the psychiatrists and the psychologists didn't want to work with the psychiatrists, and the psychiatrists didn't want to work with the psychologists. Okay, don't ask. I thought it was going to be a Norman Rockwell painting where we were going to change the world and all get along. So as it turns out, it's better that we did play to our individual backgrounds and strengths, because doctors typically are more timid than psychologists. So the psychiatrists with a background in medicine, I found, are much less, not nearly as bold and as involved in social issues generally as the psychologists are. We bring different strengths and weaknesses. So it's the Climate Psychology Alliance North America and Climate Psychiatry Alliance. So there's been a lot of work that we've done influencing our colleagues. We've given presentations in front of endless numbers of people. We've reached really tens of millions of people through the press and television, et cetera. But I still felt that the activism wing was not really as vibrant as I thought it should be. And this is where I'm going to now segue to you guys. And that is that we organized something called the Outreach and Advocacy Committee, which is a joint project of those two groups. And the Outreach and Advocacy Committee is, as the name suggests, we're all about not waiting for people to come to ask us for a paper or a speech or a presentation, and we don't look to talk to each other. We are throwing our net out wherever anybody will listen to us. And primarily what we have evolved into, and this evolved, is that we are working with state legislatures. And we started, incredibly enough, with the state of Massachusetts. And what we provided with the help of the Council of State Governments of the Northeastern region was a legislator, very well known, Senator Pacheco, state senator, beloved. And we worked with him and gave him information, which I sent to Holly, or no, not to Holly.
I've distributed to our board
okay,
members
good.
today. Yeah.
And you can look at that. And it was the guts of what became a bill that was shaped over time with three goals in mind. And this was something that my good buddy, Mike Tidwell, who was a community organizer, which is why it's so valuable when you have people from different diverse groups. That's really our strength. And that diversity is so enriching. And Mike said, when I said, Mike, you know, what are we going to do with the psychological effects? Psychology touches everything: economics, politics, our communities, our families, everything, how well we get on physically, whether we're resilient, and all the rest. It's a two-way street. Psychology affects our physical affects our psychological health. Mike said, why don't you ask? And at first I gulped for a task force. I thought, oh my God, we're not going to study the problem, are we? And hold on. So the task force is a way for us to get in the back door to do the following. Task forces don't require a lot of the budget. So people like to be on task forces. You can bring in the people you want to sit down and talk about the extreme weather events to which a state is vulnerable. And you don't call it climate, according to Senator Pacheco. He said, just call it extreme weather events. Okay, we call it extreme weather events, fine. And the second component is that we then look at what we expect the psychological toll to be from these extreme weather events. And we have data, and we will soon have data from a nationwide survey that I'm participating in or driving with a buddy for each state. So it is testing young people's attitudes about their climate distress. Okay. And then third of all is evaluating that climate or that distress, I'm sorry, not climate, their psychological fallout from these extreme weather events, to evaluate the services that are available to both treat and restore the mental health of our communities. So it's a backdoor way of saying, hello, do you think climate might be a problem? And here's what we're going to do. And each time you propose a bill and it's dropped, a hearing is usually asked for, as you probably well know. So what we would have is someone who can talk about the extreme weather events of the state, of course. And then we will have a conservative, in other words, a faith leader, primarily looking for someone who is likely an evangelical. And I know a lot of evangelicals because I made it my business with a group that we started a number of years ago called Interfaith Moral Action on Climate. So we have a number of evangelical leaders in each state who can help us to keep the conservative of the legislators from running out of the room, because they will talk about stewardship and how God and the Lord wants us to do right by what he created. And they can speak a language that people who are immersed in that kind of language are likely to respond to. So it's not a fire and brimstone, it's a stewardship issue, preserving God's bounty, because that's what God wants us to do. All right. So then the second component, or the third component, I guess, second, would be a mental health professional from the state who has, of course, maybe living next door or near to a legislator and can attest to the psychological damage. And we will have that survey available, or can talk about it generally. And then last of all, a young person who has suffered from the losses and can speak very personally about what that means to him or her, to feel as if government is not protecting him or her, and to exhort policymakers to hear that they are at the tip of the spear and that the cumulative toll of inaction will disproportionately fall on their shoulders, and that they exhort policymakers to take this seriously. So that is what I'm hoping. We have now Massachusetts. We started to work on Maryland. We have Connecticut, which will be easy. New York State. These are all the places we're working. And guess who has been at the very top of our list? Once I went to Southwest Florida.
Florida.
And I met all of you and became almost mesmerized by the feeling of camaraderie and honor that you exhibit, the respect for the beauty and bounty that is around us, and for the preserving respectfully what belongs to future generations, and to not taking more than our share, and indeed restoring what we've already taken too much of. So I have to say that being with all of you and listening to the outrage of medical personnel beside themselves with the disproportionate responsibility that they have felt to try to compensate for government inaction, to hear firsthand the kids talking about what they've suffered, to see faith leaders like you going the extra mile to try to reach out to people. How could I not want to have our mobilization look at Florida? And indeed, tomorrow morning, I'm talking with someone whom I hope will put us or me in touch with a philanthropist, a woman who might want to throw us some money. So I am looking to you to form that posse, the point people, the council, a group that spearheads and generates what we hope will be a mobilization across teachers and students and mental health professionals and doctors and faith leaders and any honorable person to address what it is that we know has to be done, and very quickly.
How inspiring. How wonderful, Lise.
Yes. That is truly a way in the back door.
Right?
Yes, it's a way in the back door. Somebody has finally figured out how to do that. We live in a state that, as we know, they're just not talking. All they're doing is talking about wokeness. And so I think that this is perfect for us. It's I'm wondering tomorrow at our summit that we're going
to a conference that's resiliency is a big part of the subject matter and climate change. So a 2-day conference in Fort Myers.
What we found is that most of these conferences are people talking to us.
Yep.
They talk for hours about their accomplishments, what they're doing, and then that's it. So talk to us about what you have found is the secret sauce in dealing with climate change for the average person.
Okay, well, thanks for asking that question.
Good question.
Yeah. So I worked for years alone, providing individual therapy to people. And I do know enough about neuroscience now. And that was one of the fun things about the book, and it's in the book, is that neuroscience now allows us to pinpoint where a lot of brain functions lie. And one of the things that we have found is that on the right side of the brain, in a specific region, they're like neighborhoods in the brain, we process in what becomes kind of an echo chamber some of our most distressing thoughts. And we tend to ruminate, especially if we're not speaking about it with others or we're engaged in solo activities. And underneath the rumination, we quickly find that there are depressive feelings. So the echo chamber, which we've all been in because of the pandemic, becomes a source of rumination and solo dialogue that takes place in the dark. And underneath all of that are the depressive feelings. Well, magically, nature knew what to do. And it turns out that when we do what we were built to do, which was to survive in groups and to use our safety in numbers, it's the other side of the brain, the contralateral, exact same spot, but on the other side of the brain. It's so fascinating what nature has done. And on that side, what happens is that particular zone gets activated when, lo and behold, we find ourselves with our kindred spirits, like tonight, and we engage in collective behaviors. And what happens that receptor sites which are reward centers, get activated. So it reinforces with dopamine and serotonin, the feel-good neurotransmitters. And so it's reinforced that we're feeling good. And then it doesn't stop there. Those receptor sites connect with opioid receptors, which are the body's natural painkillers. When we're throwing those sandbags to keep water from rising up, no matter how tired or hungry we are, and we get that transcendent feeling of being a part of something bigger, those are opioid receptors that are reinforcing our behavior. So if we want to know what the magic sauce is, it's right here.
It's right here.
Yeah.
Working together and mobilizing among others. Yes, Gary.
Yeah, this is so fascinating. Just this afternoon, I received a book from a very, very dear friend of mine who has done work in the prison system for 30 years. And he is working in law enforcement and prison systems and teaching emotional intelligence.
Mhm.
And he talks about the way that that changes the system that people are working in. And so when we view the system that we're involved in, it really promotes or retards our development in moving the way that we need to move in order for us to deal with our own health. And it's like, for me, I'm really thinking about, we shouldn't be rebuilding on barrier islands. We shouldn't be doing a lot of things that are taking place following Ian. We ought to be preparing for the water rising and flooding South Florida. And,
Good slip. Yeah, not here. Must be South America
Right.
where they're going to have flooding problem.
but we
All the Americans.
we who have been part of the flow group have had a conversation with men who did a lot of design work for New Orleans after they were flooded. And the problem, he said, is basically not the people who are left in the town who are going to have to leave. It's going to be in the communities where those people have to retreat to. And so
They're not wanted. They're not wanted.
Right.
They are not, no one, the infrastructure is not prepared for them.
Right.
They become scapegoated.
Yeah. And so it's so complex. I don't know how we help people who have so many vested interests in keeping the system operating the way that it is, how we get beyond those interests to be able to look at a path forward that is fair for everyone.
Do you know Betty Osceola?
Yes.
Of course.
Osceola is so incredible when she's a Native American, and everything seems to affect her and her tribes more than the usual just American people here. And she's one of the most incredible people. And whenever I see things that she worries about, or it's much more interesting than having just a regular American doing this.
European American.
Yeah, regular European American. Are you familiar with her?
Oh, we know her well.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
know.
but Lise, we need to introduce you to Betty when you come back here and take you out into the Everglades.
Oh,
Yes.
Understood.
by the way, I speak to you from Piscataway lands.
Thank you for acknowledging where you are, where you're sitting. And I know people in this call are probably sitting in different places too. So we, the settler colonialists, we have a lot of work to do to use that indigenous wisdom to help us heal. You know, one of the things that Betty has said is, you can't be healing the earth and solving climate change if you don't heal yourselves first. But I have to tell you how healing it was for me while my house was still, while we were doing heavy lifting here for many, many weeks in a row, how healing it was for me to leave my house and go to Fort Myers Beach and to spend 4 hours every week for a couple of weeks in total disaster, serving food to hungry people living under the bridge, to do service, to step out of myself, even as a victim of this disaster, to help others, to give away the things we need to let go of now to those that lost everything, feels so good. It's really healing to me. And so I think that's part of that secret sauce that you and Linda are talking about, is the need for community. Thank you.
Yes, the need for community.
I saw that little thumbs up over there, Helen. And the other places where we went to give were like churches where there were immigrants that nobody was going to help, you know? And so to go to those little churches when my big church wasn't willing to do anything to help, I went and found little churches that were really hurting, and they were helping everyone around them.
Mm.
Isn't that
I'm
interesting?
going to have to leave shortly for another meeting, but Lisa, I want to make sure I hope that you have talked to Linda about how we might follow up on your suggestion.
Your target, you got a target on your back.
Okay. Well, here's I made no, that's not it. I have a link of that paper that you were talking about that you sent to Linda. I could put the link right in here. I made it into a Google document.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
I sent that out to our board members. Ensign, even you got a copy of it too. And Gary and Holly and Joe and those who didn't come.
Yeah, before this call is over, that link will be in the chat. Yeah.
Okay, and before I go, I have to tell you.
Well, let me, before you go, say thank you. You guys are just amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Just decided
And right back at you.
Yeah.
You are totally amazing, and we have great things that we can do together.
We do,
working
we
together
do,
together.
and we're going to.
We're
Creating
going to.
secret sauce.
Keywords. Ensign, you had something to say?
I just want to say, I was a corporate Fortune 500 finance guy for 15 years, and then got into the investment business. And one of the things that's come into the investment business in the last 10, 15 years is behavioral finance. And not maybe totally surprisingly, we find out that humans do not operate in their own self-interest. They're not rational. We're emotional creatures, and our decision-making is emotional, and it's crazy. And most striking is where we have always posited in economics, when I went through it 100 years ago, the economic man. It was a rational person faced with the facts would make decisions that were, by and large, logical and so forth. And that's not the case at all. We're finding out in investment, people are crazy. I mean, the way they make decisions are so much against their self-interest and rational thought that it's really striking. So I just wonder how that relates to what our thinking is relative to climate and environmental adaptation and dealing with the realities that are coming down the pipe.
Is that a question?
Yeah, the question is,
okay, well,
given that we don't make decisions in our own self-interest because of however our decision making works. How do we work the problem? And I think what's really striking to me, Lise, is that I really love this, because until we get to the way people think and react, we don't know how to interact or intervene to try to direct things in a positive direction, meaning take positive actions.
So let me say that, Ensign, I'm very sorry I didn't get all of what you said, because it wasn't 100% clear to me. The audio wasn't great for me.
Yeah.
I don't know about others. Okay, but the gist of it is, indeed, you're right. We are not. Who said we were rational? And to remind you, 70–80% of what we do is unconsciously driven. But here's what I try to think about. Just as there are climate tipping points, there are social tipping points. And to paraphrase an economist, it is true that, or I embrace this when I think about some of the disastrously self-destructive decisions that we are making and watching them unfold right in front of my eyes and wondering when we're going to get smart. The realization that social norms are created when not everybody thinks something, but when key people who are thought leaders in our domain, not necessarily fancy thought leaders, but thought leaders within our communities, begin to make changes, that what happens is that, and this is what The Economist says, things take longer to change than you ever thought they would. And then they happen faster, they change faster than you ever could have imagined. And that's the role of social norms, the herd mentality. Once it's no longer cool or popular to engage in climate destructive behaviors, it's uncouth. Well, we won't be smoking. We will be buckling up. We will be practicing safe sex. We will be looking at all of the very unethical behaviors that are contributing to our demise here and that of nature. So that's what I hang on to, that things take longer than we ever thought they would to change, and then things change faster than we ever could have imagined. And holding on to the notion of social tipping points and the role that people like us influencing others who respect us and might listen to us plays in changing the rest of our communities.
Thank you so much. This has been so great, Lise. And we're excited to be part of what you're doing. You know, bring that to Florida.
I wake up in the middle of the night thinking, Florida, reset. Southwest to Florida, reset. I know we'll be there.
Your love.
Thank you.
Thank you for all you do.
If we could turn Florida, we could turn the world.
Well, see, that's exactly right.
Exactly.
We get press in Florida. It is a much louder bang than getting it in Connecticut. Let's face it.
Right.